Since starting this channel 3 years ago now, I have published many Spanish short stories to help you guys learn and improve your Spanish. Everything from mysteries to relatable family situations to characters who have their lives transformed in some way, sometimes by the simplest occurrences. Since I personally love stories and love learning through them, it's been so thrilling for me to see your response as well and see how many of you enjoy doing the exact same thing. However, if you're new to this idea of learning Spanish through stories, it may seem very foreign to you. How can I actually learn Spanish through a story that's completely in Spanish? So today I want to walk you through my 4-step method for getting the most out of your learning through stories. Comencemos, amigos. All right, guys, before we get into our steps, I want to let you know that if you're a bit short on time right now, you cannot watch this entire video, or if you're like me and you just kind of want a really quick, handy, portable guide where you can see all of these steps listed out in detail so that you can just kind of check off what you need to do, then definitely head over and download my free guide that I just created for you guys called How to Master Spanish with Stories. You can get that at ericarialanguage.com/stories. All right, so I call this 4-step method the 4C method. So we have context, comprehension, control, and creation. So let's talk about each one of those. We start with context. Now, one of the obvious benefits of learning Spanish through stories is that you are already starting with context. Context is so important because the brain is constantly trying to figure out, why does this matter? Is this important enough for me to try to hang on to? When you are trying to learn very random vocabulary words that are not familiar to your brain because you haven't heard them very much and they sound foreign because they still are in a foreign language to your brain, it's very hard for the brain to care enough to want to hang on to those words. Or if you are trying to learn the subjunctive mood or direct and indirect object pronouns or reflexive verbs, it's also hard for your brain to identify with that enough to help you actually speak the language correctly just because you're studying that grammar. It's just not natural. This is not how we learned our first language, and the brain has a hard time understanding why that information matters enough to hang on to and how it's actually going to translate into using the language. However, when we start with a context that's perhaps relatable or that we're enjoying, and when that context, or that story in this case, is filled with the vocabulary that you're trying to learn or that grammar point that you're trying to master, but instead of learning the rules, you're really seeing it demonstrated in a natural way, that's when the brain starts to hang on to these new words, to this new sentence structure. So context is definitely important, but it's important to choose the right context. So at a minimum, the story that you're using, if you're using stories as your principal way of learning Spanish, then it is a must that your stories contain both the text that you can read and the audio that you can listen to. At a minimum, they need to include those two features. In addition, this context should be at the comprehensible input level for you, because if it's too easy, you're going to learn little, and if it's too hard, you're going to learn little. So you really have to strike the balance and find the stories that fit into this category of comprehensible input for you. So how can you do that? Well, you can ask yourself, am I able to follow along with the general idea of this story? Am I enjoying it? And the more times that I read and listen to this story, am I picking up on more and more? See, if you are, that's a good sign, because the thing is, the first pass of reading or listening to the story may not quite be at the comprehensible level for you. But if you find that if you go over it multiple times, you're actually able to pick up on more and more, that means that you do have this vocabulary stored in your brain. It's just being brought out as you're exposed more and more to this context, so that's an excellent sign. So never be discouraged if the first time around something is not quite comprehensible for you. Do give it a chance and go over it multiple times. And in a moment, we're going to talk about additional ways that you can make this even more comprehensible. But this is a good place to start. See if you can follow along with the general idea, and then that gives you an indication that this will probably be good material for you to work with. Now, your comprehensible input through this story should also be engaging. So ask yourself, is this material entertaining to me? Am I enjoying this story? Or is this story highly relevant to me? If you're really interested in cooking and you have Spanish speaking friends that you want to cook with, for example, and then you have a story about cooking that is actually introducing you to a lot of that vocabulary that you're going to need, that's an example of a story that's highly relevant for your situation. So is the story just really entertaining for you, or is it relevant to you? Now note that it doesn't necessarily have to be both. If it is, that's fantastic, icing on the cake. But you're still going to learn a ton from things that are just simply entertaining for you, because that's enough brain connection for the brain to actually care. Entertainment is actually important. So that could be one factor, or it could be something that's not as fun for you, but you're engaged anyway because you know that you're learning the words that you need to know for specific situations that you know you're walking into. Either one leads to an engaging story. So that is the context step, and that is how you choose what story to work with. Now, the second step is comprehension. And here we just dig deeper into getting the most juice out of the story as possible. Remember that even though we're starting at the comprehensible input level, the only thing that means is that you're able to follow along with a general idea. You probably want to go deeper than that. So this comprehension stage helps you to do just that. So I'm going to list some ways that you can make the story more comprehensible. Keep in mind that some of these depend on what additional features your Spanish story may come with. So feel free to pick and choose between what you think you can reasonably do using the material that you're using, that remember that at least has the text and audio. We have to have both of those two features. And again, you can find this list on that free PDF download, so don't feel like you have to remember it. Okay, so first make sure that you're using the text of the story. If you, for example, started out just listening, if this was an audiobook or something, make sure you now bring in the text, because you're going to notice more. You're going to see cognates, those words that look the same or similar in English and Spanish. You're going to see words that your ear just missed the first time because they were just kind of put together and you just couldn't distinguish them. Bring in the text of the story. On the flip side, if you were just reading, bring in the audio at this point. It is so important for you to make that connection between what you're reading and what you're listening to. It's going to help your pronunciation. It's going to help you actually know how these words are said and help your listening comprehension as well. Use any visual aids that are available. If there are pictures, see if those help you follow along. If there is video, then that will definitely help you follow along with what is happening. When you can see everything visually demonstrated on your screen or in your book, however you are choosing to consume this story. If your story is designed for Spanish learners and therefore perhaps comes with comprehension activities, vocabulary activities, things that you can do to start to get involved, well, use them. That's another aid that you have. Perhaps definitions of the lesser known words. Use all of those tools. Those are going to help you with your comprehension. Identify new words and phrases. So as you go through the story, you're going to pick up on those words that you already know. And as we mentioned, going through it several times helps you kind of get to that point where you have extracted all that you can by yourself. So at this point, I do identify those new words and phrases. You can learn some brand new words and phrases from the context alone, but when you cannot deduce the meaning of certain words or phrases through the context, don't be afraid to use a dictionary or some other tool like that. It can be a simple free online dictionary like SpanishDict.com, WordReference.com. Those are my two personal favorites, completely free to use. because they give you several definition options so that you can see which one best fits your context. They give you sample sentences so that you can just really get an idea of what these new words mean. And that, of course, is going to directly increase your comprehension. Now, it is usually not going to be necessary to look up every single unknown word. Unless there are just very few of them in your context, don't try to look up everything. Do try to first let the context guide you. And then when you run into something that it's just kind of keeping you stuck, like you feel like it is preventing you from following along with the plot at this point, that's a good opportunity to look up those words or phrases and see what you're missing. And it's going to be a lot easier to hang on to them as well because you started from context. Instead of starting with a random word and then trying to put it in a random context, you actually started with the context first, and now you're just looking up those definitions to help you understand and continue the flow of the story. By this point, you have a really good understanding of the story. You're able to follow along, you're enjoying it, you've learned some new words. Step 3 control at this point is more about the grammar or the sentence structure of the story. And you will be so surprised that the more you expose yourself to the story, the more you expose yourself to Spanish in general, the more you're going to be able to naturally pick up on the grammar and the sentence structure. And you'll find yourself sometimes forming sentences and saying, how did I even know how to say it that way? You'll find yourself no longer translating from English to Spanish, but just getting used to how Spanish sentences are structured, which is a really, really beautiful thing. Because the truth is, you actually cannot learn a language through studying grammar. And this is one of the many reasons why most school systems fail to produce fluent students. However, grammar does give us that opportunity to be able to put a name on our trouble spots. And once we identify an area where we're kind of struggling where we speak, that can then help us focus in on that area in order to improve it. And when you choose to put your focus on one grammar point at a time, then you're adding some control to your learning. So far, you've been learning kind of very freely, and in this step, you just add a little bit of control to what you're doing. So this could be an area that you already know that you're struggling with, like por versus para, or it could be an area that your tutor has pointed out that you're kind of struggling with, reflexive verbs, pronouns, the preterite versus imperfect past tenses, for example. So choose a focus based on what you know you need to work on, or another way of doing it is to let the story guide you. And if you are seeing certain grammatical patterns that are just coming up over and over again, like why is se used so often? Why is se coming before all of these verbs? What does this mean? Then you'll need just enough explanation to be able to notice when that grammatical pattern comes up in the story. You may need some help with that at first, maybe from a tutor to help point that out to you so that you can start to notice on your own. And then a set of controlled activities that also have that focus so that you can start to turn your input into output and you can start practicing with that one point that you're trying to focus on. And by doing this, you'll be well on your way to developing your own perceptive skills and noticing this grammatical pattern more and more on your own, even without help. And that's going to help you to adapt it further into your own speech and writing. And as you go about your Spanish learning with that story and just throughout your week or your month, however long you decide to have that focus, see how often you can find that. You're probably going to start to spot that specific grammar point more often than you were before because your brain is now laser focused on it. And now see, can I apply this in my own speech and my own writing? Now that I've seen it so many times in so many different sentences, I know what this is. Can I now apply this? How can I do that? Because that way you can start to little by little incorporate this new item that you're learning and start to clean up some of the mistakes that you were making in your speaking and your writing, which is really exciting when you can see yourself progress like that. Our final step, step 4, is creation. And now it's time to really go out and practice what you've learned. You started that in the control process where you started to try to apply what you were learning, perhaps with specific exercises that were about that certain thing, that certain grammatical pattern. But now at this point, you really want to create something all your own. So you've spent time reading and listening to someone else's creation, someone else's story. But what can you do with that yourself? How can you put the new vocabulary and grammar that you've acquired to use? Well, there are a few ways to do it. I have some suggestions. You could create your own piece of writing based on the story that you just read by summarizing it in your own words, or by rewriting a part of it from a different point of view. If the story is written in third person and talks about he and she did this, then perhaps you can rewrite parts of it and see if you can change the verbs and say, I did this, right? So that's one way you can kind of create a piece of writing based on the story. Another way to create is to write about something completely different, completely personal and relevant to you, but just include some of those new vocabulary words and that one grammar focus that you have been working on in your personal writing. You could also take it to conversation. So you could discuss what you've read, what you've learned with someone else who has read that same story. Or you could summarize the story with your words for your tutor and have them point out some corrections along the way as you do that. So these are all ways that you are now outputting, you are now taking that input and you are creating something that's your own. By following this simple 4-step process, you are not only going to progress beautifully with your Spanish, but you're going to have a lot of fun doing it because you're starting with something that's just already enjoyable, and that's stories. I wish you all the best with this method. It's something that's worked really well for me and for hundreds of other students that I teach. So the next step at this point is to not forget the steps. So go ahead and head over to erikareelanguage.com/stories and download your free guide that has everything that we went over today within it. I'll see you next time, guys. In the meantime, don't forget to go out and live your new language today. Bye-bye.